Brothers and sisters, peace be with you. Thank God. It is time to read Bible. Let's continue to read Matthew chapter 7. We will start from verse 13 today. Sermon on the Mount is the first sermon of Jesus' teaching that Matthew put together. He gave a summary from chapter 5, verse 1 to chapter 7, verse 12. Let's do a brief review. Chapter 5, verse 1 and 2 tells us the main target of Sermon on the Mount. It was not the group of people who follow Jesus or seek the agreement, or those people who try to gain some benefits. Jesus left those people at the foot of the mountain. He went up to the mountain. There were some disciples around him. This sermon was preached to those disciples. This is very important. Otherwise, we will not apply this sermon correctly. Jesus revealed the constitution of the heaven to these disciples who were willing to follow him. First, he defined what kind of the people were the people of the kingdom of the heavens and the virtues that they should have. They are those people who had the reality of the Beatitudes. Then Jesus went on to talk about the testimonies that these people of the kingdom should have. They were the salt on the earth and light in the world. Then starting from chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus spoke in detail about the standard of the life of the kingdom people. They were not like the Mosaic laws, which regulated people's behaviors. The constitution of kingdom of heaven regulated the motivation in people's hearts. The standard of the life of the kingdom people starts from chapter 5, verse 17, and ends at chapter 7, verse 12. Therefore, Jesus summed up this paragraph on chapter 7, verse 12, which is, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. Then continue to chapter 7, verse 13 to chapter 7, verse 27. This last paragraph was still spoken to the disciples. It asked the disciples, what is your responsibility after you listen to the constitution of the kingdom of the heavens? With great wisdom, Matthew sorted out Jesus' speech and put them into 6 different choices. First are 2 gates, then 2 ways, then 2 trees, 2 kinds of the work, 2 foundations, and 2 types of the house. In another word, the disciples had to constantly make choices on the way of following the law. This was their responsibility. This was also their lifelong lesson. God's requirement to the disciples were not the success of their work or the achievement of their goals, because the goal of the work was set by the law. The ability of the work also came from the law. What we should be responsible for in our life is how we choose. Dear brothers and sisters, this is the last reminder Jesus gave to the disciples around him. It is also the responsibility of every one of us who is willing to follow the law today. There have always been 2 different choices before us. Which door would you enter? Which way would you walk? What kind of tree would you grow into? What is the outcome of the work? Do you have the right foundation? Do you have the right construction? Let's read verse 13 and 14. It talks about 2 types of the gates and 2 ways here. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which lead to life, and there are few who find it. Jesus started off by telling his disciples, enter by the narrow gate. Before we talk about narrow gate, let's take a look at what is a gate. John chapter 10, verse 7, Jesus clearly said to his disciples, most assuredly, I said to you, I am the door of the sheep. Then continue to verse 9. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be safe, and will go in and out and find pasture. We must go through Jesus Christ to have salvation. He is the door. Apart from Jesus, we cannot be saved. If we enter from the door of Christ, we will be saved. We will not only be saved, but also go in and out and find pasture. Because Jesus Christ has rich provision, Jesus' target of the Sermon on the Mount was the disciples. They believed in Jesus and had followed Jesus. They had entered the door of Jesus. Jesus said, he will be saved. And because they have the rich provision of life, they will go in and out and find pasture. To all these people who were saved by grace, Jesus also told them, enter by the narrow gate. What is the narrow gate? Actually, Jesus was the first one to enter into the narrow gate. He was the second person of the triune God. He is the only beloved Son of God the Father. He is eternal and infinite. But for the salvation plan of God the Father, he put down the glorious throne in the heaven. He came down to the earth and took the image of a man. He was born by Virgin Mary. An infinite man was limited in the boundary of a finite man. What a big constraint Jesus was put under. He chose the narrow gate. He took the image of man. He will finish the work of salvation. So he was the first one entering by the narrow gate. During the time of his ministry on earth, Jesus also called disciples. He also encouraged them to enter by the narrow gate. What is narrow gate to the disciples? It was actually the A type of the people that we were told at the beginning in the constitution of the kingdom of the heavens. They must be poor in spirit. There must be those who mourn in the soul and those who are meek in the soul. They have boundary in their lives. To themselves, they are those who hunger and thirst for the righteousness. To others, they are those who are merciful. To God, they are pure in heart. To Satan, they are peacemakers. In their whole life, they are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. After Jesus talked about the constitution of the kingdom of the heavens, he encouraged the disciples around him to enter by the narrow gate and to work hard to become the people of the kingdom. Why? Jesus continued to give the reasons. There are two different choices after one is saved by grace. One is enter by narrow gate and walk on the narrow way. The other one is enter by the wide gate and walk on the broad way. Two gates and two ways lead to two different ends. One leads to life, the other leads to destruction. Let's look at leading to destruction first. For wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. This verse is not easy to understand because of the word destruction. If Jesus said this to his disciples should all have been saved by grace. How could they go into destruction? Let's take a look at destruction first. The Greek word can be translated into destruction or perish, and it can also be translated into waste. Matthew used this word 2 times. The first one is here. For wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. The second time is in Matthew chapter 26, verse 8. When Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? The Greek word of waste is the same as the word destruction in chapter 7, verse 13. So we can also read, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to waste, and there are many who go in by it. On the contrary, the way which leads to life Chinese Union Version translated it into eternity. The Greek word is zoe, which means life. Because narrow is the gate, and the difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Actually, Jesus pointed out that there were two gates, two ways which would lead to two ends. The two ends are the principle of the two choices. If you choose the way which leads to life, narrow is the gate and difficult is the way, and there are few who find it. The end is that you gain life. If you choose waste, wide is the gate and broad is the way, and there are many who go in by it. But at the end, it is a waste. Therefore, we all have two different choices after we are saved by grace. One choice is which door you will enter by. Do you want to enter by the narrow gate, which has the boundary, or do you want to enter by the wide gate? Jesus entered by narrow gate. He was the glorious God, but he took image of a man who has no form or comeliness and was under a lot of constraint. Do you want to become the person who has the Beatitudes but was under a lot of constraints? Or do you want to become someone who follow the flesh and live freely? Once you enter into the gate, you need to walk. There are also two ways. One way is narrow, which is the way of the cross, just as what's said in the constitution of the kingdom of heavens. It is not about your behavior, but the motivation behind your behavior. Dear brothers and sisters, we should know a principle here. We enter the gate first, then we walk the way. We often see that many saints couldn't decide which gate to enter by. A lot of time was wasted in making the choices. It is not worthwhile. Our time in our life is limited. There is a long way to go after we enter into the gate. Therefore, do not waste too much time in choosing the gate. Once we choose, we should start to walk. The nature of this narrow way is that there are only few people. In the Bible, the salvation of God has been following the principle of regnum. Just as what we read in Genesis, God wanted to save Jacob's family from the famine. Therefore, he sent Joseph ahead to Egypt. In appearance, he was sold by his brother, but Joseph gave testimony. He was the remnant chosen by God. Under God's sovereignty, he came to Egypt so that he could save his family during the famine. Likewise, the way to the heaven is also under the principle of regnum. There are few people who enter by the narrow gate and walk the narrow way. On the contrary, there are many people who enter the wide gate and walk the broad way and waste their whole life. Dear brothers and sisters, this is a reminder as well as a comfort for us. When we walk on the way of life, naturally there will only be few people. On the way of following the Lord, do not look at the glory of men. Do not look at the success of men. Do not look at the number in the church. Do not look at how thriving the ministry of the church is. What we should look at is whether what we do is after God's heart and whether we walk on the way of life. There are only few people entering by the narrow gate and walking on the narrow way. Therefore, they are not eye-catching in the world. On the contrary, there are many who enter the wide gate and walk on broad way. But wide is the way leading to destruction, perish or waste. The answer is in verse 15. Jesus continued to warn his disciples, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. When there are many people, there are many resources. It attracted a group of false prophets. They came in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Outwardly they appear to be a sheep, but inwardly they don't have the life of a sheep. Instead, They have the life of wolves. Wolves come to capture the sheep. They take sheep as their resources and their tools. They don't care a bit about the life of the sheep. Paul said to the elder of Ephesian church in Acts chapter 20, verse 28 to 30. God made them overseer to shepherd God's church. They must take heed to themselves. Verse 29. For I know this, that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Verse 30. Also from among yourself men will rise up, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after themselves. The purpose of these false prophets was to draw away people after themselves. Christians are often compared to sheep. The flock belong to God, because Jesus Christ purchased with his life to redeem us to give back to God. Therefore, the brothers and sisters at the church all belongs to God. These false prophets came to draw away God's flocks. They might be very familiar with Bible. There might not be anything wrong in what they preach, but they are not sheep. They don't have the life of the sheep. Their purpose is to use the flock as their leverage and their capital to gain their interest in the world. It is difficult to distinguish from the outward appearance because they are in sheep's clothing. Jesus warned the disciples here to be aware of the false prophets, not the false teaching, because the false teaching is not frightening. God's words, which is this Bible in our hand. As long as you are willing to read and seek, soon you will be able to see through the false teaching. But false prophet is more difficult to deal with. They sound real. Their teaching also sound right, but their motivation is wrong. They want to take the flocks as their own. Therefore, to false prophet, we should not listen to what they say. We should look at their lives, especially their fruits. Verse 16, you will know them by their fruits. Of course, it takes a long time for a tree to bear the fruits, so it takes a while to tell the false prophet. Dear brothers and sisters, we should have a correct understanding of the church life. The church who enter by narrow gate and walk narrow path will not have a lot of people. But because they are not eye-catching and they would rather walk the way of life, therefore, chance for them to have the false prophet is slim. On the contrary, those that enter by wide gate and walk the broad way, because there are many people, they often become the target for the false prophet. May God give us wisdom and the spirit of revelation so that we can tell what kind of church life please God. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for giving us the wisdom of salvation so that we can become God's children through believing in Jesus Christ. Please continue to have mercy on us in our Christian life so that we're willing to enter by the narrow gate and walk the way of cross. May you give us some spiritual companions so that we can encourage each other in this narrow way and we can continue to hold on to the principle of life. Because we don't care about the praise of man, but we care about pleasing you. Bless the church I am at and the church life. Pray in Jesus' name.